Our modest home in Willow Creek Estates represented everything my husband David and I had worked for. The small three-bedroom lakeside property was not the largest or most impressive in our community, but for us, it was paradise. We had saved for years to afford this piece of tranquility where our son Cameron could grow up with fresh air, friendly neighbors, and the beautiful lake that stretched behind our backyard. We had lived there for 5 peaceful years, our mortgage payments always on time despite occasional financial struggles. Cameron had just turned 10 that spring, a bright, energetic boy with unruly brown hair and a scatter of freckles across his nose that multiplied every summer. He loved that lake more than anything. While other kids his age begged for video games or trips to the mall, Cameron only ever asked for swimming gear. He collected goggles, snorkels, and flotation devices with the serious dedication of a professional athlete. The community lake was his sanctuary, his playground, and his greatest joy. That day began like any other perfect summer Saturday in July. The sky stretched endlessly blue above our neighborhood, without a single cloud to provide relief from the heat that settled over our community like a heavy blanket. The temperature had already reached 92 degrees by 10 in the morning, and the forecast promised it would climb higher. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have the lake so close, as I watched neighbors retreat into air-conditioned homes or huddle beneath shade trees with books and cold drinks. I had heard about them, of course, the self-appointed lake patrol that had formed about 2 years ago. 3 men who drove around in a golf cart with clipboards and serious expressions, monitoring the community amenities as if they had been hired to do so. My neighbor Ellen had warned me about them at our mailboxes last month, rolling her eyes as she described how they had cited her for having too many guests at her lakeside barbecue. "They gave me an actual ticket," she had said, digging through her purse to show me a printed document with an official-looking letterhead. "Said I needed to pay a $150 fine for exceeding guest capacity. Can you believe that?" I had laughed and dismissed it as neighborhood politics, the kind of petty drama that exists in any community. But they cannot actually enforce that right. They are not real security, I had asked. Ellen had shrugged. Most people just pay to avoid the hassle. They threaten to put liens on houses. Nobody wants to test if they really can. I had forgotten all about that conversation until that Saturday when Cameron raced down to the lake after lunch, beach towel flapping behind him like a bright blue flag. His friends Ethan and Mia were waiting for him at the shore, already splashing in the shallows. From my home office window on the 2nd floor, I had a perfect view of the lake and the children. I could work while keeping an eye on them, a routine we had established years ago. I settled into my desk chair, joining a work conference call that could not be rescheduled despite it being a weekend. The fan whirred quietly overhead as I discussed quarterly projections with colleagues, half my attention on the computer screen and half on the children playing below. It was during a particularly boring segment about regional sales figures that I noticed the golf cart moving along the shoreline. 3 men in matching navy polo shirts circled slowly, scanning the area with the vigilance of security guards at a high-risk facility. I recognized them from community gatherings. Marcus Bennett, the oldest and apparent leader, a retired pharmaceutical sales manager who had moved to our community after his wife passed away. Richard Dawson, a failed real estate developer who had lost several properties during the housing market crash. And Trevor Harper, the youngest, perhaps in his early 30s, who always seemed to be looking for someone to intimidate. They called themselves the Lake Patrol, though no one had elected or appointed them to any official position. I turned my attention back to my screen, listening to my boss drone on about market opportunities. I had no way of knowing that in less than 60 minutes, our peaceful existence would be completely shattered, and my son would be fighting for his life against people who had no real authority but wielded power like a weapon. The three men who called themselves the Lake Patrol had created their own little empire within our community through fear and intimidation. Their golf cart gleamed under the summer sun, freshly washed and polished like a trophy. On its side, they had affixed a professionally printed logo they had designed themselves, a blue shield with the words Willow Creek Estates Lake Safety Enforcement emblazoned in gold lettering. It looked official, authoritative, and completely fraudulent. Marcus Bennett always took the lead. At 65, he had the stern, disapproving demeanor of someone who had spent decades in management and refused to relinquish that power in retirement. His silver hair was always precisely combed, his polo shirt always tucked neatly into khaki pants that never showed a wrinkle. He carried a clipboard filled with papers he had drafted himself, regulations that mimicked official legal language but held no actual authority. Marcus had been the first to suggest forming their group after complaining about declining standards at a community meeting where his proposals for stricter rules had been voted down. Richard Dawson followed Marcus like a shadow. In his late 50s, Richard had once owned several properties in the area before financial mismanagement, and the housing crash had stripped him of his fortune. Now he compensated for his failures by wielding small powers over others. He rarely spoke, preferring instead to document perceived infractions with his camera or use the bullhorn he carried to amplify Marcus's commands. The bullhorn was especially effective at startling residents into compliance before they had time to question the men's authority. Trevor Harper was the muscle of their operation. 32 years old and built like a former college athlete gone slightly to seed, he wore his body camera prominently on his chest and made sure everyone noticed it. What most residents did not know was that Trevor only activated the camera selectively, recording encounters from the moment after their group had provoked a reaction. The footage would later be edited to show only residents responding angrily to their reasonable requests. For nearly 2 years, these men had operated in a gray area that blended intimidation with the appearance of legitimacy. They had printed official-looking violation notices on watermarked paper. They had created badges that they wore clipped to their polo shirts, metal shields that caught the light and resembled those carried by actual law enforcement. They had even drafted a resident compliance agreement that they pressured new homeowners to sign during move-in, a document with no legal standing but impressive-looking seals and signatures. Their targets were not random. They focused their attention on families who could not afford legal battles. Single parents, elderly residents on fixed incomes, households where English was not the first language. They imposed fines for invented violations, threatening property liens that they had no power to enforce. The money they collected went directly into their personal bank accounts, a slush fund that financed their equipment and provided them each with a comfortable supplemental income. That afternoon, as the children played in the lake, the patrol approached with stern expressions. Marcus made a show of checking his clipboard before engaging his bullhorn. "Attention swimmers, the lake will be closing in 15 minutes for mandatory water quality testing. All residents must exit the water immediately." There had never been scheduled water quality testing in our community before. The lake was tested monthly by county officials who always posted notices at least a week in advance. The children looked at each other in confusion, but began slowly moving toward the shore. All except Cameron and his friends, who remained in water up to their waists, uncertain if they needed to leave. "You three," Marcus called, pointing at Cameron, Ethan, and Mia. "Did you not hear the announcement? Exit the water now." "But we just got here," Cameron protested, his voice respectful but clearly disappointed. "The county tested the water last week. It was fine." Trevor stepped forward, his face hardening. New regulations require weekly testing during peak summer months. Are you refusing to comply with lake safety protocols? Richard began filming with his handheld camera, carefully focusing only on the children and not capturing his colleague's aggressive stance. We have 3 juvenile rule violations at the South Shore, documenting noncompliance now. The other children who had already left the water watched nervously from the sandy beach area. Parents who had been supervising from shade trees began moving closer, sensing the rising tension. Trevor waded into the shallow water, grabbing Cameron by the arm when my son attempted to move past him toward the shore. "This one needs to learn about respecting authority," Trevor said, his fingers digging into Cameron's small bicep. "We have had issues with this particular resident before." This was a complete lie. Cameron had never had any previous encounters with these men. I could see my son's face register confusion and then fear as Trevor maintained his grip. The other children scattered quickly, leaving Cameron alone with the 3 men. "Let go of me, please," Cameron said, his voice wavering slightly. "I am going to the shore. You are hurting my arm." "First, you need to apologize for your disrespectful attitude," Marcus demanded, standing at the water's edge with his clipboard raised like a judge's gavel. "Lake access is a privilege, not a right. We can revoke your swimming privileges for the remainder of the summer." From my window, I could see Cameron's small form surrounded by the 3 adult men, confusion and fear evident even from a distance. That was the moment I ended my work call mid-sentence, pushing back from my desk with such force that my chair slammed against the wall. Something was very wrong, and every parental instinct within me was screaming to get to my son immediately. I raced down the stairs, nearly tripping over our cat in my desperate hurry to reach the back door. Through the kitchen window, I could see the situation deteriorating rapidly at the shoreline. Trevor still had his hand clamped on Cameron's arm, while Marcus gestured emphatically with his clipboard. Even from this distance, I could see the fear in my son's eyes, a look no parent should ever have to witness. "Let go of my son," I shouted as I burst through our back door and sprinted down the grassy slope toward the lake. My heart hammered against my ribs, adrenaline flooding my system and driving me forward. Other parents were now moving toward the scene as well, but I was closest, my maternal instinct propelling me with unnatural speed. Richard Dawson swung his camera toward me, carefully documenting my approach but not the grip Trevor maintained on Cameron. "We have an aggressive adult approaching Lake Patrol officers," he narrated calmly, as if providing commentary for a nature documentary. "Subject appears hostile and uncooperative. These children are trespassing in a restricted area during scheduled maintenance," Marcus announced as I reached them, positioning himself between me and Cameron. He held up his clipboard like a shield, his face a mask of bureaucratic certainty. Section 12, Paragraph 3 of the Willow Creek Estates Lake Usage Agreement clearly states that all residents must comply with safety personnel during scheduled closures. "There is no scheduled closure," I countered, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "And these are not trespassing children. They are residents using the community lake that our HOA fees pay for. Now let go of my son." Cameron called out to me, his voice tight with fear. "Mom, they said I was breaking rules. I was not. I was just swimming with my friends." Trevor's grip tightened visibly, causing Cameron to wince. "Your son has displayed a persistent pattern of disregard for community regulations," he said, though Cameron had never had any previous encounters with these men. "We are simply enforcing the rules that everyone agreed to when purchasing property in this neighborhood." Other parents had reached us now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Mia's mother stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "You have no right to touch any of our children. Let him go right now, or I am calling the police." Richard raised his bullhorn in response. Interfering with Lake Patrol officers during a safety procedure is a violation of community bylaws. All non-essential personnel must clear the area immediately. "We are not leaving without our children," another parent shouted from behind me. "And you are not officers of anything." Marcus reached into his pocket and produced a laminated card with the same unofficial logo that adorned their golf cart. "We are duly appointed representatives of the Willow Creek Estates Lake Safety Committee, authorized to enforce all regulations pertaining to communal water facilities." "That committee does not exist," I said, taking another step forward, my eyes fixed on Cameron's increasingly pale face. "I have attended every HOA meeting for the past 5 years. No such committee has ever been formed or authorized. Now let go of my son before I call the actual police." That was when the situation exploded from confrontation into nightmare. Trevor's face darkened with rage at having his authority questioned so publicly. He turned to Cameron, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "This is what happens when children do not respect the rules." What happened next seemed to unfold in horrifying slow motion. Trevor suddenly pushed Cameron backward, deeper into the lake, and then forced him face down into the water. One large hand held the back of my son's head, pressing his face beneath the surface. "Trevor is demonstrating proper respect for lake regulations," Marcus announced calmly, as if this was a normal educational moment. "Sometimes children need to learn through direct experience." 1 second passed, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. "Stop it," I screamed, lunging forward only to be blocked by Marcus and his clipboard. "He cannot breathe. You are drowning him." Cameron's legs kicked desperately beneath the water, his arms flailing as he tried to push himself up against Trevor's superior strength. Around us, parents were shouting, children were crying, and Richard continued filming selectively, capturing only the growing crowd of interfering residents, and not the assault happening in front of us. 10 seconds underwater now, 15 seconds. "This is how we maintain order in our community," Marcus declared, his voice raised to be heard over the commotion. "Children must learn consequences for their actions." I shoved past Marcus with all my strength, knocking him sideways into the shallow water. Richard stepped in front of me, his camera inches from my face. "Assault on a Lake Patrol officer. This will result in immediate eviction proceedings." 20 seconds underwater. My son's movements were becoming weaker, less coordinated. Another parent, a former military man named Chris, was wading into the water toward Trevor, his face twisted in fury. But he would not reach them in time. 25 seconds. Cameron had gone still beneath Trevor's hand. With a scream that tore from the deepest part of my soul, I launched myself at Trevor, knocking him sideways with the full force of my body. As he fell, his grip on Cameron released. My son's limp form floated face down in the water, unmoving. "Call 911, I screamed as I grabbed Cameron and flipped him over. His lips were blue, his eyes closed. No breath stirred his chest. "Somebody call 911 right now." As parents scrambled for phones, the 3 men of the Lake Patrol backed away slowly, already constructing their narrative. I heard Marcus saying calmly to Richard's still recording camera, "We attempted to assist a child in distress who had been swimming unsupervised. The mother became combative when we tried to help." I dragged Cameron's limp body to the shore, blind to everything but the terrifying stillness of my child. In that moment, as neighbors raced toward us and sirens began to wail in the distance, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. These men had crossed a line from harassment to something unforgivable, and they would pay for what they had done to my son. Water streamed from Cameron's mouth and nose as I laid him on his side on the sandy shore. My CPR training from years ago suddenly resurfaced through the fog of panic. I positioned him properly and began chest compressions, counting under my breath, willing his heart to respond. His skin felt cold despite the summer heat, his lips and fingernails showing that terrible blue tint that would haunt my nightmares for months to come. "Come on, baby," I pleaded between compressions. "Breathe for mommy, please breathe." Neighbors formed a protective circle around us, shielding us from the lake patrol who had retreated to their golf cart but remained nearby, already constructing their defensive narrative. I could hear Marcus speaking in formal, measured tones to anyone who would listen. The boy was swimming in a restricted area. We were simply enforcing safety protocols when he panicked and inhaled water accidentally. We immediately attempted life-saving measures, but the mother became hysterical and interfered with our efforts. Every word was a lie, but I had no energy to spare for rage. All my focus remained on Cameron's still form beneath my hands. 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths, 30 more compressions. His chest remained frighteningly motionless under my palms. "The ambulance is 3 minutes out," someone called from behind me. It was Ellen, my neighbor, her phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "Keep going, Sarah, keep going." After what felt like an eternity, Cameron's body suddenly convulsed beneath my hands. He coughed weakly, water spilling from his mouth as he gasped for air. The sound of that desperate, ragged breath was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I turned him gently onto his side, supporting his head as he continued to expel lake water from his lungs. "That is it, sweetheart," I whispered, tears blurring my vision. "Just breathe, help is coming." His eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and confused before closing again. But he was breathing. Shallow, labored breaths, but breathing. The ambulance arrived in a flash of lights and urgent activity, reflecting off the lake water that had nearly claimed my son's life. Paramedics rushed down the slope, equipment in hand. As they took over Cameron's care, one of them asked sharply, "How long was he underwater?" "Almost 30 seconds, Chris answered, the former military neighbor who had tried to help. "That man held him down." He pointed toward Trevor, who was now speaking intently with Marcus beside their golf cart. The paramedics exchanged grim looks as they placed an oxygen mask over Cameron's face and loaded him onto a stretcher. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and efficient hands, touched my shoulder. "You can ride with us. He will need tests at the hospital right away." As we prepared to leave, 2 police cruisers pulled into the community, responding to multiple emergency calls. Richard was already approaching them, camera in hand, no doubt ready to present their edited version of events. Several neighbors moved to intercept, determined that the truth would be told. "Those men are not official anything," Ellen called to the officers. "They nearly killed that child." The ambulance doors closed on this scene, sirens wailing as we sped toward the hospital. Cameron remained unconscious on the stretcher, the oxygen mask fogging slightly with each shallow breath. The paramedic monitored his vitals, her expression carefully neutral in that way medical professionals have when they are concerned, but do not want to alarm family members. "His oxygen levels are lower than we would like," she explained gently. "The doctor will want to check for pulmonary edema. That is fluid in the lungs. It is common after near-drowning incidents." Near drowning. The term struck me like a physical blow. My son had nearly drowned, not by accident, not by his own mistake, but because 3 grown men had held him underwater to teach him a lesson. At the hospital, Cameron was rushed into the emergency department, while I was directed to a waiting area and given forms to complete with trembling hands. My husband David was out of town on a business trip, and my frantic calls had gone to voicemail. I sat alone in the sterile waiting room, still in my damp clothes, as doctors assessed my son. Hours passed in that timeless way of hospital waiting rooms. Occasionally, nurses would update me. They are running tests. The doctor is with him now. He is stable but still unconscious. Each update provided minimal reassurance but no real answers. Finally, a doctor appeared, her face showing the careful neutrality that medical professionals maintain when delivering difficult news. "Mrs. Mitchell, I am Dr. Patel. Cameron is stable, but we are concerned about several issues." She explained in careful terms how Cameron was suffering from pulmonary edema, the fluid in his lungs from the near-drowning incident. There were also concerns about possible hypoxia, oxygen deprivation that could potentially affect brain function. They were monitoring him closely and had admitted him to the pediatric intensive care unit. "Can I see him?" I asked, my voice barely recognizable to my own ears. Dr. Patel nodded. "Of course, but I should prepare you. He is connected to several monitors, and we have him lightly sedated to help his body heal." As she led me to the PICU, she hesitated, then asked, "The paramedics mentioned this was not an accident. They said someone held your son underwater. Is that accurate?" "Yes," I replied, my voice steadying as the shock began to crystallize into something harder, colder. "3 men who pretend to be HOA security. They held my 10-year-old son underwater until he lost consciousness. They nearly killed him to prove they had power over us." Dr. Patel's professional demeanor cracked slightly, her eyes flashing with indignation. "The police officers outside will want to take your statement. Do you intend to press charges against the men who did this?" As we reached the door to Cameron's room, I looked through the window at my son's small form beneath hospital sheets, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that monitored every breath and heartbeat. In that moment, something shifted within me, grief and fear transforming into cold, implacable resolve. "Yes," I answered, my voice steady and certain. "I am going to make sure they pay for what they did to my son. I am going to make sure they never hurt another child again." 1 week after the incident, Detective Maria Ramirez sat at my kitchen table, spreading documents across the wooden surface like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. Cameron was upstairs, finally home from the hospital but still recovering. His breathing remained labored, and nightmares interrupted his sleep several times each night. I could hear my husband David moving quietly in Cameron's room, reading to him from his favorite book to help him fall asleep again after another frightening dream. We executed search warrants on the homes of all 3 men, Detective Ramirez explained, her voice professional but tinged with disgust. What we found was extensive. She laid out photographs of Marcus Bennett's home office. Shelves lined with binders, each meticulously labeled and organized. Close-up images showed the contents: falsified HOA bylaws with forged signatures, detailed logs of violations with dates and times, and receipts for fines collected from residents. Most disturbing was a color-coded database with names of every family in Willow Creek Estates, categorized by what the men called compliance risk and financial leverage potential. They were specifically targeting certain households, Detective Ramirez explained, pointing to highlighted entries. Single parents, elderly residents, families who spoke English as a second language, people they believed would not fight back for financial or social reasons. My own name appeared on the list, categorized as moderate resistance potential with a note. Husband travels frequently. Financial resources limited due to recent medical expenses. They had been watching us, studying us, identifying our vulnerabilities. The invasion of privacy made my skin crawl. Their financial records show they collected approximately $87,000 in fake fines over the past 2 years. The detective continued, sliding bank statements across the table. None of it reported as income. They divided it equally among themselves as administrative compensation. Most disturbing were the photographs, hundreds of them, documenting encounters with residents, including children. Images of people looking confused, afraid, or angry as they were confronted by the lake patrol. Each photo was annotated with names, dates, and assessments of how easily each resident could be intimidated. There were multiple photographs of children using the community amenities, with notations identifying problematic behavior that invariably meant nothing more than normal childhood activities. "This is where it gets even worse," Detective Ramirez said, her expression darkening as she opened a folder marked Community Acquisition Strategy. They were not just collecting money or power tripping. They had a long-term plan. The documents inside outlined a systematic approach to forcing out specific homeowners through escalating harassment, selective enforcement of fake rules, and manufactured violations. The goal was to create such stress and financial burden that targeted families would sell their homes at below-market prices. Property evaluation sheets showed which homes they intended to purchase through a shell company they had already established. Once they owned enough properties, they planned to legitimately take control of the actual HOA board, the detective explained. They would essentially own the community they had been terrorizing. The evidence was overwhelming and sickening. What had begun as an investigation into a single assault had expanded into something much larger. Multiple felony charges were now on the table: assault, fraud, extortion, criminal conspiracy, attempted manslaughter. 17 families have come forward since the incident with your son, Detective Ramirez told me, closing her folders. People who were too frightened or embarrassed to speak up before. Some paid thousands in fake fines. Others changed their daily routines to avoid confrontations. One elderly couple actually put their home on the market because they could not handle the stress of being constantly monitored and harassed. Security camera footage from multiple homes around the community had been collected, showing the men's pattern of intimidation escalating over time. Physical intimidation had become more common in recent months, pushing the boundaries of what they could get away with. Cameron had been the breaking point, the moment when their actions crossed from harassment into life-threatening criminal behavior. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach as I processed the scope of what these men had been doing in our community for years. "The district attorney is preparing charges," Detective Ramirez explained. "The evidence is substantial. These men will face serious consequences for what they have done." As she gathered her documents, the detective paused, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "How is your son doing?" I glanced toward the stairs where David was still reading quietly to Cameron. "The physical injuries will heal. The doctors say his lungs should recover completely with time, but the psychological trauma—" I trailed off, thinking of the night terrors, the way Cameron now panicked at the sight of water, even in the bathtub. "That may take longer." Detective Ramirez nodded solemnly. "Children are resilient, but what happened to him was traumatic. We have victim advocates who can help connect you with appropriate counseling services." As she prepared to leave, she added, "We will need Cameron's testimony for the trial, but we will make the process as gentle as possible for him. Child victims have special protections in court." Standing at the door, watching the detective walk to her car, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Horror at what these men had done and planned to do, relief that they had been stopped, and beneath it all, a steely determination that justice would be served. These men had tried to drown my son. Now they would face the full weight of the legal system they had pretended to represent. The county courthouse loomed over us, an imposing structure of red brick and white columns that seemed to dwarf my son as we climbed the steps 3 months after the incident. Cameron clutched my hand tightly, his palms sweaty with anxiety. The night before, he had awakened screaming from another nightmare about drowning. The bath that morning had been another ordeal, with him rigid with fear at even the shallow water in the tub. Still, he had insisted on coming today, on facing the men who had hurt him. "I want to tell what they did," he had said at breakfast, his voice small but determined, "so they cannot hurt any other kids." Inside the courtroom, the 3 defendants sat at a polished wooden table, transformed from the intimidating figures in polo shirts to respectable-looking men in tailored suits. Marcus Bennett, silver-haired and somber, nodded to his attorney with the confident air of someone who expected to be exonerated. Richard Dawson stared straight ahead, his face betraying nothing. Trevor Harper, the youngest and the one who had physically assaulted Cameron, looked almost boyish in his navy suit, impossible to connect with the man who had held a child underwater until he lost consciousness. Their defense attorney, an expensive-looking woman in a crisp black suit, had constructed a careful narrative. These were community volunteers who had been overzealous in their commitment to safety. There had been no criminal intent, merely a regrettable miscommunication that had escalated unfortunately. Trevor had not meant to harm Cameron, but had been attempting to demonstrate proper water safety techniques that had gone awry. The prosecutor, a steady, methodical man named Thomas Williams, approached the case differently. He built it layer by layer, starting not with the assault on Cameron but with the years of systematic harassment and fraud that had preceded it. He called witness after witness, elderly residents who had paid hundreds in fake fines out of fear, families who had been targeted because English was their second language, homeowners who had documentation of threats and intimidation. "These men were not volunteers," he explained to the jury during opening statements. "They were con artists running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that escalated from fraud to violence. They preyed on the vulnerable, collected illegal funds, and ultimately assaulted a child so severely that he nearly died." When Cameron's turn came to testify, the courtroom fell silent. He looked so small in the witness stand, his legs not quite reaching the floor. The judge had granted special accommodations, allowing me to sit nearby and removing the defendants from Cameron's direct line of sight. Even so, his voice trembled as he began to speak. "I was just swimming with my friends," he explained, his eyes downcast. "They came and said we had to get out because of new rules. I did not understand because we had permission to swim there. I was trying to leave when the man grabbed me." He described the feeling of Trevor's hand on his arm, the sudden shock of being pushed into deeper water, and then the terrifying sensation of being held beneath the surface. His voice grew so quiet that the court reporter had to ask him to speak up. "I could not breathe," he said, his eyes filling with tears. "I tried to push up, but he was too strong. Water went in my nose and mouth. Everything started to feel far away. I thought I was going to die." Medical experts testified about the 37 seconds Cameron had spent underwater, according to multiple witness accounts. The damage to his respiratory system was documented in clinical detail, along with the psychological aftermath that continued to affect his daily life. The pediatric psychiatrist who had been treating Cameron explained that he now suffered from acute anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a severe phobia of water that would require long-term therapy. The defense strategy relied heavily on portraying the men as well-intentioned community members who had made a single terrible mistake. Their attorney emphasized their previously clean records, their involvement in community activities, their families, and standing in the church. They had not meant to harm anyone, she insisted. They had only wanted to maintain standards in the neighborhood they loved. This narrative collapsed entirely when the prosecution presented their key evidence, enhanced audio from Trevor's own body camera, recovered during the search of his home. The footage had been edited to begin only after the confrontation started, but the audio remained intact. In it, Marcus Bennett could be heard clearly instructing Trevor, "Teach the boy a lesson about respect. Make sure he understands who makes the rules here." And then, most damning of all, as Cameron struggled underwater, Richard Dawson's voice. Not too long, just enough to scare him. The defendants' faces drained of color as their own recorded voices played through the courtroom speakers. The carefully constructed image of concerned community volunteers shattered completely, revealing the calculated cruelty that had nearly cost my son his life. When the prosecution rested their case, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. These were not overzealous volunteers who had made a mistake. They were predators who had terrorized a community and assaulted a child. The only question that remained was how severe their punishment would be. In the matter of State versus Bennett, Dawson, and Harper, on the count of attempted manslaughter, the jury finds the defendants guilty. The foreman's voice echoed through the hushed courtroom, steady and certain. She continued through the list of charges: criminal conspiracy, fraud, extortion, assault on a minor, impersonating officials, criminal harassment. Guilty on all counts. I reached for Cameron's hand, feeling his small fingers squeeze mine in response. After 6 days of testimony and evidence, after facing his attackers in court, after reliving the trauma of that day at the lake, justice had finally arrived. The sentencing followed 1 week later. Judge Alina Martinez addressed the courtroom with a gravity that silenced even the whispers of observers. "The court has rarely seen a case that combines such calculated cruelty with such brazen disregard for human life," she stated, looking directly at the 3 defendants. "You preyed upon the vulnerable. You created a climate of fear. And ultimately, you assaulted a child so severely that he nearly died. These actions demand the most serious consequences." Marcus Bennett, as the architect of the scheme, received 18 years in state prison. Richard Dawson, 12 years for his role in documenting and facilitating their crimes. Trevor Harper, who had physically assaulted Cameron, was sentenced to